So in this lecture, I want to discuss the paper by POPLACK. The title is quite interesting because it says, sometimes I'll start a sentence in Spanish y termino en español. This means that sometimes I start a sentence in Spanish and finish in Spanish. So this paper is about code switching, as I discussed last week, but title is an example for a code switch sentence. So it was quite witty for Shana to title this paper in this way. And in Shana Poplack's paper, she first defines code switching as follows. It's a random alternation of two languages, and this type of alternation happens both between and within sentences. So it could happen in one sentence. You can start a sentence in Spanish, finish it in English, or you can have it between sentences. That means first sentence can be in Spanish, the second sentence can be in English, third sentence Spanish, and the fourth in English. That kind of alternation could happen as well. But she also discusses a classic way of defining code switches. Here, Pedro Pedraza, 1978, defines code switching as follows. There were speakers who code switched because they lacked full command of Spanish, and those who code switched because they lacked full command of English. As you can see from the part, they lacked full command of Spanish or full command of English. This is in a way supporting a deficiency hypothesis. Since a speaker is deficient in some language skills, that's why they code switch. So it has a negative connotation. It has a connotation such as people are confused, or somehow people don't have a proper level of communicative skills in neither languages. So as I discussed earlier, there are negative opinions concerning code switches, and this definition from 1978 from Pedraza shows what kind of negative meaning code switches used to have back then. And this paper is based on immigrants or population in New York, in a district or community called El Brillo, which is on 102nd Street of New York. I have Google map here. You can see El Brillo is marked with this red arrow, and it's quite close to Manhattan, as you can see. It's on the island of New York, and it's close to downtown. If you zoom further, zoom out, you can see that New York State looks like this, and El Brillo is placed here. And the community where Shana Poplack did her field work is like this. This is explained in her paper as well. You have a multi-story flats. That's where people live. And there are often stairs outside like this. And there are shops on the first floor. Here you can see a dry cleaner, laundromat. Oh, sorry, it's not a dry cleaner. It's a place where you can do laundry, coin laundry in Japanese. Or there are kebab shops or bakery. All sorts of shops occupy the first floor of the buildings, and you have a ladder on the outside, and you can go up to your flat using these ladders. And the community where Shana collected data um, looks like this. Here is more pictures of El Brio. You see quite a traffic on the street, and you can see some buildings on the right and left hand sides of the street. And also there are shops like this, and there is an underpath you can see that could be an entry to a subway system in New York. And here I want to discuss briefly about certain rules that code switching follows. This part will be, I'm sure, explained deeply by one of you when you have presentations, but I just briefly want to introduce what kind of constraints or rules there are that Shana proposes in her paper. So what she proposes is that code switching is not random. They follow some constraints or some rules. And the first rule is called the free morpheme constraint. In this constraint, Shana says that there is no code switches within a word, and you cannot only change setsubishi, such as suffix like ing or ed. So if it's Japanese English code switching, you can never say run shita or hashi ed. That kind of code switches are illegal according to the free morpheme constraint. This chart here is about the second constraint. It comes from figure 1 from page 586 of your paper. And this is a little bit more complicated than the first constraint, but I hope I'll be able to explain it well. So here the sentence A in figure 1 is in English, sentence B is in Spanish, and sentence C is just to explain what the Spanish sentence means. So let's look at the first line, English. I told him that so that he would bring it fast. What you see here is that the difference between English and Spanish word order, and you can see with arrows. For example, let's look at the part I told him, and the Spanish word order is opposite. So we say I him told instead of I told him, and that's clear from the crossing lines of the arrows. And the rest look good until you get to the second verb of an embedded sentence. He would bring it fast. Again, it, the object it, comes before the verb. So it would bring would be a word order in Spanish. So what Shana says is that code switching doesn't happen at all these two places where there's a crisscross of arrows. So you can change I to a Spanish yo, or you can change that to Spanish eso, or so that to paque. But the rest of the part where you have to worry about the word order, this is the part where there are no switches between Spanish and English. So you cannot just say I told and then change him to Spanish like le, because that would produce a conflict between Spanish and English word orders. And I hope this was clear to you. So there are two constraints that Shana came up with in this paper, and she wants to say that code switching is not that random because it follows certain rules or certain constraints. So this is the hypothesis that Shanna came up with. She thinks that code switching happens more among group membership. So what it means is that you have a certain code to belong to a membership. So it's kind of like a dialect or register you speak in your friendship group. So if you are talking to your friends, you might use wakamono kotoba, or you might use certain words that your friends all understand. And if in your group, if everyone is bilingual, and if everyone is switching between the sentences, we also use code switching. And especially Shannon POPLACK thinks that people use intrasentential code switching among friendship groups. Intrasentential means that 文の中で起こる。文と文の間ではなくて文章の文中で起こるコードスイッチングがあると。And this is a communication style that is distinctive to your group members. And it's like shows that you belong to that group and you use it for communication within your group. And the sample means participants or the people who took part in the study comes from, as I said earlier, from Manhattan Island, from the 102nd Street. And this is a district where 95% of the population is Puerto Rican. So they either come from Puerto Rico or they are second generation Puerto Rican. And here it says half of the people were born and raised in Puerto Rico and they moved afterwards to New York. And older people tend to belong to this group, and they are Spanish dominant because they grew up in Puerto Rico speaking Spanish. However, there's a certain group of people who were born in El Barrio. So they are younger generation. They could be children to the people in the first group, group of people that I just described. So the second group of people were born here. They are second generation. They are younger, and they are either English dominant or very balanced bilingual. So probably they were born in Manhattan Island, so they were born in this community. Probably they went to school and they learned English at school. They were taught all sorts of subjects like math, science, PE, English, social studies, all in English. So the schooling took place in English. So they must at least understand certain, that they must have a certain level of English in order to carry on their school lives in English schools. So they are either English dominant or they come home and they talk to their parents in Spanish. So their home language maybe were Spanish. So they could be bilingual, quite balanced, and they can function very well in both languages. And Shanna found 20 informants. Their sample was 20 informants, and half of which were Spanish dominant. So 10 people were Spanish dominant, and 10% English dominant. So that would be 2 people. And then the rest were bilingual. So 8 people were bilingual, I suppose. So 10 Spanish dominant, 2 English dominant, and 8 bilingual people. And it consists of 11 male and 9 female participants. And Shanna did interview these people, and she did look for cases of code switching within their interviews. But before she carried on her interviews, She at first started her experiment or her field work asking those participants to fill in a questionnaire. And she called it language attitude questionnaire, which means their attitude, taido, toward languages. And these participants judged their own language abilities, and 55% people say they are mainly Spanish speaking, and 45% said they are bilingual. And nobody claimed that they are English dominant. Nobody said they speak English most of the times. And 60% of the sample, so 60% of the 20 people, which is 12 people, they learned English between ages of 7 and 21. So 7 is, I guess, quite late considering the critical period ends around the age of puberty, so 11 or 12. So some people learned English after their puberty, after their critical period, some in the middle of the critical period. And she wanted to see if code switching is caused by lack of availability in L2. So do people code switch from English to Spanish because they have problems finding words, so maybe shortage of their vocabulary or lack of availability in L2. And she also asked questions about attitudes, about ethnic identity scale. This is quite interesting because people often say that identity and the language are really closely related to each other. For example, 65% of the informants said they have positive identification as Puerto Rican. So they identify themselves positively as Puerto Rican. So they are proud of being Puerto Rico. They are proud that they were born in Puerto Rico. They are from Puerto Rico. They must think that Puerto Rico is their mother country. And 90% of the people say Spanish is important to being a Puerto Rican. So maybe you can think about yourself and your identity. So you must have lots of identity. Some people must think, oh, you are representative of a female Japanese 20-year-old. Maybe you have an identity as the person I'm from Himeji, or I'm from Akashi, or I'm from Kobe, or I'm from Shikoku. They might have quite a strong identity of your birthplace. そう、もし、私は東京出身であるということを強く誇りに思うとか、私は東京人としてのアイデンティティを強く思うというような人は、東京の喋り方を捨てたくないと思うんですね。あるいは、九州出身の方、方言、九州の喋り方を全く捨ててしまって関西人になりきれるかというとどうなんでしょうか。というふうにアイデンティティとラングエッジ、自分が保持する言葉っていうのはとても関係が深く、例えばこの被験者たちはプエルトリコから、7歳から21歳の間にアメリカに来たと。けれどもスペイン語をもう全く捨ててしまってアメリカ人と同化してアメリカ人と変わらないような英語を喋りたいか。あるいは皆さん考えてみてください。英語を喋れるってかっこいいなと思うと思います。アメリカ人みたいに英語がペラペラ喋れたらいいなと思う。もしかしたらイギリス人みたいにオーストラリア人みたいにと思うかもしれません。けれどももしみんなが今、移民としてそれぞれの国に引っ越ししたら、日本語の能力っていうのは もう捨ててしまっていいと思いますか？あるいはみんなの日本のパスポートとかはどうでしょう？アメリカのグリーンカードがもらえるんだったら日本のパスポートは捨ててもいいかなって思うかもしれません。あるいはいや私は日本の自分のルーツを大切にしたいと思う人もいるかもしれない。でこの自分の母国に対するあるいは自分が生まれた国に対するアイデンティティとか協調性とかどれぐらい強く思うかっていうのはその自分のアクセントに関係してくるというふうなことが言われています。例えば皆さんが英語をしゃべるときに、もしかしたら日本語っぽい英語を話すかもしれません。それは自分がアメリカ人と同じとは見られたくない、あるいは自分のルーツを大切にしたいと思って、もしかしたら日本語の単語を少し残していたり、日本語のアクセントが捨てられなかったりするような人もいるかもしれません。よくここで例に使われるのがニューヨークやカナダ、モントリオール、トロントに住んでいるイタリア人、イタリアのクォーターに住んでいるイタリアンクォーターに住んでいる人々やアメリカに住んでいる日系、アメリカ人の人のことをちょっと考えてみてください。私はカナダのモントリオールで実は何年か住んだんですけど、そこにとても美味しいピザ屋さんとかパスタ屋さんがあるイタリアンクォーターがありました。そこに行くと若い、イタリアン系カナダ人の人がピザとかレストランで働いているんですけど、その人たちはもしかしたらカナダで生まれたかもしれない、えー第3世第4世かもしれない、そんな人々がカナダの白人のカナダ人のカナダで生まれ育った、あるいはおじいちゃんもおばあちゃんもひいおじいちゃんもひいおばあちゃんもカナダ人っていうような人と比べるとやっぱり英語が少し違うんですよね。でイタリアっぽい英語を話したり、またイタリアの単語を英語に混ぜたりするようなことが見られました。で本当はカナダ人のみたいにカナダ人のように喋りたかったらきっと喋られると思うんですけど、どこかに自分がイタリア人であること、自分の先祖に、誇りを持っていて、何か自分を他のカナダ人とは違うということを浮き立たせるためのアクセントを残したり、また、イタリアのボキャブラリーを残したりする。また、アメリカに住んでいる、よくカリフォルニアとかには日系の方が多いですよね。福島先生はブラジルの日系人なんですけど、日系の人が話す英語やポルトガル語も多分そうだと思うんですけど、考えてみると、もう何年も何年もアメリカに住んでいるのに、実は私の友達が3世なんですけど、彼女の英語の中にすごく日本語の単語がいっぱい出てくるんですよね。英語を喋ってたら本当にアメリカ人なんですけど、なんか面白い単語が、今日、あゆみ、what do you want for ご飯とか、おじいちゃん said this とか、あゆみ、you are married to 白人とか、そういうふうに日本語を混ぜながら喋るんですよね。で、そこにも私は他のアメリカ人とは違うんだとか、私はこういうアイデンティティがあるのだっていうようなことを残しているのかなと思うんですけど、すいません長くなりました。ここで言いたいのは、attitudinal characteristics are highly related to your language skills or maintenance of your language. So that's why Shanna Poplack carried out this questionnaire. And then next, she went on to data collection. And she collected data, she ran interviews, and she collected 66 hours of tape recording. Can you imagine? That's a lot of recordings. And she looked through or heard through all these 66 hours. Actually, this is her PhD thesis. So if you are doing a doctoral dissertation for Hakasego, you might put in this much work, but 66 hours of listening of some interviews, you can imagine how time consuming and how difficult it has been. And from there, she found 1,835 instances of code switching. So that's a lot of instances. So 1835例を見つけました。And also she found that balanced bilinguals switched 4 times as frequently as with an in-group interlocutor as a non-member. What she means here is that バイリンガルの、バランスの取れたバイリンガルの被験者たちはイングループ、自分の、そのインタビュアーがですね、同じグループから来た人であるっていうふうに分かっている時の方が、全然知らない人、あるいは他のバイリンガルの人と喋っている時と比べて4倍コードスイッチをしたということですね。だからif you feel comfortable, if you think you share the same background, and if you know the person really well,you code switch more. 多分みんなが喋っていて楽しいと思うような相手ですね。タメ語を使って喋るような相手。そういう風なリラックスして、自分はイングループの人と喋ってるんだって思うと、自分もバイリンガルだし、この人もバイリンガルだし、同じような生活をしている。すると、自分のモードがバイリンガルモードになって、コードスイッチングが4倍多く起こったということがここでわかります。で、here it says、relaxed manner, neutral setting, gossip setting. So when they talk about gossips, they code switch more. And code switch sentences are introduced here in examples. So they say, I mean, 何やろ、いや、Dios mío, oh my god とか、次は悪い言葉ですけど、あるいは、entiendes わかったみたいな時に entiendes っていうようなスパニッシュを使う例が結構出てきたというふうに書いてあります。で、ここではその、66時間の、インタビューを聞いて、ポプラクさんはどんな風な、コードスイッチが行われたかっていうのを見ました。で、例えば文と文の間でスパニッシュから英語に変わっている、あるいは文中文内でスパニッシュから英語に変わっているっていう風なのを、いろんなバイリンガルのタイプに分けてみました。で、この表を見ると、これは、スパニッシュドミナントバイリンゴ、スペイン語が優勢なバイリンゴですね。So these are the people who were probably born and raised in Puerto Rico and moved to New York when they're, for example, teenagers. で、この人たちの中で、いろんな種類の人がいるんですけど、ほとんどの人がタグクエスチョンのところで、タグは不可疑問ですね。like, aren't you coming? You're coming, aren't you? みたいな感じですね。そういう不可疑問の部分だけ、スパニッシュに変えるみたいな。日本語で言うと、It's really cold ね today みたいな、ねとかよみたいなのをつけちゃうっていうような感じですね。で、こういうのがスパニッシュドミナントバイリンガルに多いコードスイッチになります。で、these are the people who report that they feel more comfortable in Spanish, they use more Spanish than English, and they tend to switch into L2 by means of tag-like constructions. So what it means is that they use English in the tag cases. So ブラブラブラブラスパニッシュで言って isn't it みたいな英語の部分を付け加えるみたいなタグの、コードスイッチングが多かった。So now let's look at the second group of people. So these are more balanced cases, or some are maybe more English dominant. But what you see here is like a reverse. さっきの山形の反対ですよね。So these people don't have very many tag switches. What they do is they switch intrasententially. そう、文の一文の文内で文中で英語からスパニッシュに変えている人が多い。So instead of Yamagata, so there are two people who have a similar pattern to the first group. Two people who are Tencent and they have Yamagata pattern. But most of the people, a majority of the people have なんか、反対の、塀の反対みたいな、チェックマークみたいなパターンを、見せていて、they prefer intrasentential code switching. So this is clear from this graph. So those are the people who claim to be bilingual. They show a reversal pattern, as you just saw in figure 2b, and they favor large amounts of the switches, hypothesized to require most knowledge of both languages, sentential and intrasentential switches. で、このスイッチってタグクエスチョンだけ英語に変えるっていうようなスイッチはとても簡単ですよね。で、みんなも日本語と英語で考えてみたら、英語で喋ってねとかよをつける、そうじゃないとかでしょとかをつける。それはあんまり何も考えなくても、あるいは2つの日本語と英語のグラマーを知らなくても、ただ付け足すだけだから、割と簡単にできるコードスイッチです。でも、イントラセンテンション、文の中で起こるコードスイッチングっていうのは、and it's very, very difficult because you have to keep track of two languages. And as I showed earlier in the equivalent constraint, you have to make sure that you will not violate any word order in the two languages that you are speaking. So you have to feel quite comfortable with two languages. You have to have a great command of both of the languages in order to carry out conversations. These are very, very fast conversations, and still switch in between the sentences without violating any constraints that are discussed earlier. So this is quite a skilled, technique that only fluent people, bilinguals, are able to do. So here, those who learned English between the ages of 8 and 13 showed significantly lower percentage of this type of switch. なので、英語を、例えば臨界期ギリギリ、あるいは臨界期が終わってから習った人っていうのは、この文中でスイッチをする、そのようなコードスイッチングを、slightly lower percentage、パーセントが低かったというふうに書いてあります。で、how about the people who learned English much later, somebody like after the age of 13? So this is crucially after critical period. They showed a much lower percentage of intrasentential switches. So only 30%. So this drop is significant, statistically significant. で、優位な違いだというふうに言っています。So this is the conclusion slide. And what they've found in this paper show that there is an equivalence constraint, and it provides strong evidence that code switching is a verbal skill requiring a large degree of linguistic competence. So it's not just gochamaze, it's not the case that you are confused. you have to have a skill in order to switch so freely, and you have to have a large degree of linguistic competence, as it says. So it's not just a defect. なんか不足して、故障して、混乱して起こることではない。何か知識が不足しているから機械が故障するかのように、考えられているけどもそうではないというのがこのポプラクさんの論文になります。でいろんなルールがあって、あまりフルエントではないバイリンガルにはあまりこういうルールが複雑なルールに従わなければいけないようなコードスイッチングっていうのは起こらないっていうふうに載っています。So this is quite a brief and fast explanation of POPLACK's paper. But from the next week, we are going to read more thoroughly we'll go into the paper. But since I explained, an overview of this paper, I hope you'll find it a little bit easier to find and interpret or translate what you have to read. Okay, thank you for listening and see you next week.